Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of the Tech Talk with me, Kazeem. Today's episode is not a techie episode, it's not about Azure. So, today's episode is about how to start your own podcast in 2022. And I've got Lisa Clark with me on today's episode of the Tech Talk. Hi, Lisa, and welcome to the Tech Talk Show.
Hi, Kazeem. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation.
All right, Lisa, so let's kick things off with an introduction. Who is Lisa, and can you tell us a little bit about what you do as well?
So, my name is Lisa Clark, and I am based in Dundee, Scotland. I'm a Microsoft MVP and I work in the hybrid cloud space. So I work for Dell Technologies in our global engineering outreach specialist team. That's a long team name, but we shorten it to GEOs. And I'm focused on Azure Stack and our Microsoft hybrid cloud offerings. So very much focused on Microsoft, but from a Dell Technologies perspective. So I do a lot of sales and pre-sales enablement and training. I do a lot of evangelizing of our product. And then I also do what I can to enable Dell and Microsoft to work closer together across the EMEA region. So I actually cover Europe, Middle East, and Africa in my role.
So let's delve right in now. Sometimes people say I have a YouTube channel. Some people call it a podcast. People use those two terms interchangeably now. So can you help us with a little bit of clarity on that? What is the difference between a podcast and a YouTube channel?
It's funny, isn't it? These terms have become interchangeable, really, and almost mean the same thing. When I started a podcast and I started publishing audio only. So I use Zoom to record my podcast, but I only published the audio and published it to, the likes of Apple Podcasts and Spotify, etc. So it was a podcast. It's sort of the original meaning of a podcast. It was audio only. And I did that for the first, I want to say potentially 10 or 20 episodes. And then I thought I would have a go at YouTube. And I wasn't sure about what I wanted to use my YouTube for. And I thought, why not put my podcast episodes on YouTube as well? Because people like to consume information in different ways. People like to read, people like to listen, people like to watch. And quite often, me and my guests were having discussions, and, our facial expressions would be, a big part of those discussions. So then I took my podcast episodes and I now publish them on YouTube, but also still in audio form as well on the likes of Spotify. So for me, my podcast and YouTube are kind of the same thing. Um, but with YouTube, I suppose, you can do so many different things with it. You can do individual videos, you can do demos, you can share more from a visual perspective on YouTube. But for me, currently, they are the same thing.
Let's learn from your experience now. You have your own podcast thing running, right? So why did you choose to start a podcast to start with? And why do you think anyone should care about also starting their own podcast?
So I started my podcast in March of 2020. So as we all know, that is when the world went into lockdown. I was only 6 months into a new role. Part of that role was getting back into the tech community and the Microsoft community specifically. And I was supposed to be traveling with my role, and suddenly I was locked in at home like so many others with so much more time on my hands. And I'd always thought about doing a podcast or something like that. I really love talking to people and talking in general. But I'd always put it off, use the excuse of time or not having the skills. And so when we went into lockdown, I thought, now or never. I have the time. I want to stay connected to the community. It was a very lonely time for a lot of us. And I thought, what a better way to have some amazing conversations with people across the tech community, and then also have a go at starting a podcast. So for me, it was quite personal reasons, and I would always advocate that those are the reasons that you should start something like this. I don't think you should ever start creating content of any kind because you want to be, I don't know, famous or, big, have a big following. You should do it for you, whether that be to learn and to grow and develop your own skills, or to connect with other people, to share your learnings. But I think, yeah, always start with doing it for a personal reason or goal, and everything that happens after that is just a bonus.
So let's talk gears for a little bit
Mhm.
now. What are those required gears that one would need to start a podcast or a YouTube channel, since we can use both of both of the terms interchangeably now?
Yes. So I spoke a little bit about things that had put me off starting before, and definitely, one of it was the excuse of time or not having the skills, but the other one was thinking that I needed to be some kind of sound engineer, and I had to really understand the tech that went into producing a podcast. So, I'd researched a few times before, and I'd kind of got stuck down the rabbit hole of learning about how to produce an awesome podcast, and then thought, well, I can't do this, so I'm not going to do it. But actually, a friend of mine, her name is Emma Story Gordon. She runs ESG Fitness. You can find her on Spotify and on Instagram. She was regularly producing a podcast episode. And I asked her, how are you doing this? And then she told me about a program called Anchor. So, Anchor, when I started with it, was its own company, but it's now been purchased by Spotify. And Anchor allows you to upload an MP3 file, and it handles all of the distribution. So it will create your podcast and then distribute it to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, podcast platforms that I have never heard of before. So basically, I started with a Jabra conference speaker, Zoom, and Anchor. And that's how I published the first 10 to 20 of my episodes. It was only then when I decided that I enjoyed it and I wanted to keep it going that I thought, okay, let's upgrade a little. And I upgraded to my Yeti mic. I got a better camera. I got some graphics made for my brand, Lisa at the Edge. And then I started publishing on YouTube. But think one of the biggest barriers to starting something like this is starting. So I would, do whatever you can to make it as easy as possible for you to start, um, whether that's creating a podcast or any kind of content. And once you get started, everything else comes naturally and comes easier. And everyone starts somewhere, right? So if you look at any of your favorite podcasts, or bloggers or content creators, if you scroll right back to their first episodes, you'll see everyone starts somewhere. So yeah, I would say just get started.
All right. So just like other things in life now, people sometimes want to start, but they just don't know how to start. So do you want to help us highlight some of those things that can get in the way of people starting, and how can they mitigate some of those challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that for me, the two biggest barriers were motivation and, I would say, imposter syndrome. So, on the one hand, it was motivation, right? The motivation to just do it and get started. And what I learned is that motivation is a byproduct of action. Um, Action actually precedes motivation. You can't just sit around and wait for motivation to suddenly appear. I mean, you can, but you might be waiting a long time, and then you're not really exerting any control over that. So I would say that taking action is the key to kickstarting your motivation. And then it's just like a snowball, right? It sort of continues to build itself. So what I would do is whatever it is that you're looking to start, I would break that down to the smallest steps. Look at that first step that you need to do, and then just focus on that. So complete that first step, move on to the next, and you'll soon find that the action creates that motivation. It's like when you go to clean the house, you don't really want to clean the house, but you maybe start cleaning one room and then suddenly you've got all this motivation to clean the rest of the house. And it's the same thing. So action is the key there to getting started. And imposter syndrome, that's a tough one. It's one that a lot of us deal with in tech. And I've spoke about this before on some other talks, but I did a little bit of a research into imposter syndrome to better understand it and understand how I could maybe not necessarily overcome it. I'm not sure we ever can, but to manage it. And so, yeah, I did some research into that and looked into the process of the 5 R's, which I'm sure you can Google and it'll tell you a bit more about it. But basically, it's about recognizing that imposter syndrome is what you're feeling, rationalizing it. So listing out or thinking about your achievements today, or where how far you've come already. It's reframing it. So if you have any all or nothing thoughts, they're quite big indicators of imposter syndrome. So if you have thoughts like, there's no way I can do this, I'm terrible, that's an all or nothing thought. And so it's about reframing those. So being really honest about what you can do and maybe what you've still to learn, and sort of balancing those out. And then reframing the imposter syndrome, and then readying yourself to let go of those feelings and take action anyway. But it's funny that starting a podcast or creating content, actually the two biggest barriers were mental barriers for me. They were, finding that motivation and overcoming imposter syndrome.
All right, so let's try to put it all together now. Can you please give us a summary walkthrough of what is needed, of what is required to launch a podcast? I mean, from the very first thing that you need to do to the last thing that you need to do, which I believe is getting out your content to the world once you have it finished.
So, first of all, come up with a name. That's sometimes the hardest bit. But come up with a name. If you get hung up on that, because I definitely did, just go with what you have best at that time. You can always change it. You can always rebrand. Companies do that all the time. So yeah, come up with a name, and then I would highly advise setting up an Anchor account. And that will do all of the hard work for you. So that will set up all of the distributions to, multiple podcast platforms. So that means that your listeners can listen on their platform of choice. Some people prefer Apple Podcasts, some people prefer Spotify. And then just get recording. So have a mic, have a speaker. Yes, sound quality does matter. So if you can invest in getting, a little bit of an upgrade there, I would advise it. But if not, don't worry, get started. Pick a topic, find a guest, and then get recording. Once you have recorded, and I originally started with Zoom, and I've now moved on to StreamYard. But yeah, you can start with Zoom, you can start with Teams, and then you use the MP3 file and the Anchor platform to distribute your podcast. And it's as easy as that. If you then want to also post on YouTube, create your YouTube channel. And again, you can use the video file to upload to YouTube. And you don't need to have fancy intro and outro videos when you get started. I would, remove the barriers as much as you can to getting started. Get started. Find out whether you actually like doing it, because you might not like doing it. And then once you find out that you do like doing it, or you build more of a structure and a brand and a niche, then you can invest in upgrades and branding, etc. But literally all you need to get started for a podcast is the ability to have a conversation like this with someone and record it, and then the Anchor platform. It's really, really great. It's so easy to then, you can look up yourself on Spotify podcasts, and there you are. So it's easier than ever now to start.
Just out of curiosity now, Lisa, how did you come up with your podcast name, Lisa at the Edge? Such a cool name. How did you come up with it?
So this is funny. I was about 4 months into my new role, and I had um been sort of in and out of the Microsoft community on Twitter, etc., over the years. But this role was really going to allow me the time to really get stuck back in. And so I was looking for a Twitter handle that um, would be cool and maybe relate to what I was doing. And actually, I was with my friend Kenny Lowe, friend and colleague, and we were having a wine. It was one of my first work trips, and we were discussing Twitter handle names. And I thought, I'm working in hybrid cloud. The edge is the next big thing on everyone's mind. And I am technically working in the hybrid at the edge space. And so yeah, then Lisa at the Edge came about.
Wow.
And it's been really great. It's sometimes quite annoying to write, but it's a good name.
So let's wrap up now by learning from your own experience. Yes, I know you've told us how you got started, right? But what advice do you have for those people new and looking to start their own podcast?
I think if it is something that you would like to start, please just start. Don't worry about whether you're good enough, whether people will listen to you, whether what you have to say is of value, because it will be of value. We all have different perspectives, different backgrounds, different experiences, and sometimes it's good to listen to others that have similar background experiences to you. And I think the more voices in tech, the better. So much about diversity in tech is about representation and finding people who you relate to then push you on in your tech journey. So I think the more voices we have in tech, the better. I actually didn't pay attention to my numbers for like a good few months. I was just having great fun speaking to people and then posting my podcast on Twitter and getting feedback. So yeah, don't worry about the numbers. Just get started. If you get started and it's not for you, you're not a failure. But give it a try. And start as simple as possible and then build up from there.
So thank you very much, Lisa, for joining me on today's episode of the Tech Talk. And thank you very much for all the tips that you've shared on today's episode. So please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. So here's where we're going to call it a close on today's episode of the Tech Talk. So from myself and Lisa now, it's a bye-bye, and I'll see you again another time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you.